What if I told you that Ishmael's story isn't just about the past, but could also hold a prophecy of the future? The name Ishmael means God has heard, but has the world truly listened to his story? While his half-brother Isaac became the father of the Israelite, Ishmael's path was different. His life was shaped by exile, struggle, and divine promises that would change the course of history. Yet despite being Abraham's firstborn, Ishmael is often seen as the forgotten son, the one cast out, the one removed from the covenant. But was he really forgotten? Or was he always part of something much bigger? Because here's the shocking truth. While most see Ishmael as the rejected one, God never abandoned him. In fact, Ishmael's destiny was written long before he was born. His descendants would go on to impact the world in ways few truly understand. But to see the full picture, we have to go back. Back to a time when faith was tested, when jealousy divided families, and when a single decision changed everything. Abraham, a man chosen by God to be the father of a great nation, a man with a divine promise. But there was one problem. He had no children. His wife Sarah was barren, and as the years passed, the hope of an heir began to fade. In ancient cultures, barrenness wasn't just a personal sorrow, it was a public shame. A woman without children was seen as cursed, incomplete, and for Sarah, the weight of this was unbearable. She wasn't just the wife of any man. She was the wife of a man who had been promised descendants as numerous as the stars. How could she be the chosen man's wife, and yet unable to fulfill the most basic expectation of motherhood? Desperate, Sarah made a choice that would change history. She offered her servant, Hagar, to Abraham. A common practice in ancient times, if a servant bore a child, the mistress could claim it as her own. And so, it happened. Hagar conceived. For a moment, it seemed like the problem was solved. Abraham finally had a son, his firstborn, his legacy. But Sarah's plan didn't unfold the way she imagined, because with pregnancy came a shift in power. Hagar was no longer just a servant, she was the mother of Abraham's child, and that changed everything. The household that once functioned under Sarah's control now had a new tension. Sarah, once the undisputed matriarch, now felt threatened. Hagar, though still a servant, was carrying what Sarah never could, and that changed the way she looked at Sarah. What started as a solution became a rivalry, a division, a wound that would not heal easily. What happened next would mark the beginning of a conflict that would not only divide a household, but ripple through generation, even to this day. Hagar was never meant to be part of history, at least not in Sarah's eyes. She was an Egyptian maid, a servant, a nobody. But the moment she carried Abraham's child, she became something more. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer just an outsider. She had something Sarah didn't, and that gave her confidence. Sarah noticed the shift almost immediately. Hagar no longer walked with her head down. She was no longer just Sarah's servant. She was now the mother of Abraham's son. And Sarah hated it. The Bible says that Sarah mistreated Hagar. But what does that mean? Some scholars believe it wasn't just words. It may have included emotional and even physical abuse. Whatever it was, it became unbearable. And so, Hagar did the unthinkable. She ran. But where could she go? Alone, pregnant, unprotected. She fled into the wilderness, a place that meant almost certain death. A woman traveling alone in the ancient world was vulnerable to wild animals, bandits, or worse. She had no plan, no destination, only desperation. Hour after hour, she walked through the relentless heat. The desert stretched endlessly before her, swallowing her in its emptiness. And then, exhausted and dehydrated, she collapsed near a spring of water. It was there, at her lowest moment, that something incredible happened. An angel appeared. And this was no ordinary encounter. This moment is historic, because this is the first recorded instance in the Bible where an angel personally visits a human being. And the person chosen for this divine meeting? Not Abraham, not Sarah, but Hagar. The angel didn't just speak, he called her by name. He didn't say, "Hey, Abraham's maid." He said, "Hagar, servant of Sarah, where have you come from? And where are you going?" Imagine the shock. This wasn't just a divine encounter, this was recognition. God saw her. God acknowledged her. Tears streamed down Hagar's face as she told the angel everything. How she had been mistreated, how she had run away, how she had nowhere to go. And the response? A command. Return to Sarah. But not just that. The angel gave her something more. A prophecy. "I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count." This was no small promise. Ishmael's lineage wouldn't just survive, it would thrive. And then came the name. Ishmael, meaning God has heard. In her pain, in her suffering, in her abandonment, God heard her cries. Hagar, overwhelmed, gave a name to the place where this happened. She called it Bir Lahai Roi, the well of the living one who sees me. A servant, a runaway, a woman with no status, and yet she had just encountered the living God. With renewed strength, Hagar returned to Abraham's household, carrying not just a child, but a divine promise. But the tension between her and Sarah, that was far from over, because Ishmael's place in history was about to be challenged in ways Hagar never could have imagined. For years, Ishmael was Abraham's only son. He grew up believing he was the heir, the firstborn, the one who would carry on his father's legacy. He was strong, confident, deeply loved by Abraham. But then everything changed. Sarah, who had once accepted Ishmael as a solution to her barrenness, finally had a child of her own. Against all odds, despite her old age, she gave birth to Isaac. And in that moment, Ishmael's world shifted forever. The household that had once been his was no longer the same. Suddenly, he was no longer the child of promise. Imagine what that must have felt like. For over a decade, Ishmael had been the heir. He had lived with the expectation that one day he would inherit Abraham's name, his wealth, his position. But now, he wasn't just a son. He was the other son. The tension in the household grew. Ishmael, now a teenager, could feel the shift. Sarah, who had once tolerated him, now saw him as a threat. The Bible tells us that during a great feast celebrating Isaac's weaning, Sarah saw Ishmael mocking her son. But what does that mean? Some believe Ishmael was just teasing his little brother, nothing more than typical sibling rivalry. But others suggest something deeper. Some scholars argue that Ishmael, as the older brother, was asserting dominance, reminding everyone that he was the firstborn, that he, not Isaac, should be the true heir. Could it have been an innocent moment? Maybe. But Sarah didn't see it that way. To her, it was a dangerous sign, and she wasn't going to let it continue. With fire in her eyes, she turned to Abraham and made a demand that would change Ishmael's life forever. Get rid of that slave woman and her son, for that woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac. This wasn't just about a household dispute. This was about destiny. For Abraham, this was unbearable. Ishmael was his son, his firstborn. He had laughed with him, taught him, watched him grow. To send him away felt like ripping out a piece of his own heart. He pleaded with Sarah, but she was unrelenting. Ishmael had to go. Then something unexpected happened. God spoke to Abraham. Do not be distressed about the boy and your slave woman. Listen to whatever Sarah tells you, because it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. But I will make the son of the slave into a nation also, because he is your offspring. Abraham was torn. This was his son. Yet God's words were clear. Isaac was the one through whom the covenant would pass. But what about Ishmael? Was he truly cast aside? No. God wasn't rejecting Ishmael. He was reaffirming a plan that had been in motion long before either boy was born. Ishmael would not share in the covenant, but he would still be blessed. He would become the father of a great nation. Still, for Abraham, this promise didn't make reality any less painful. The next morning, with a heavy heart, he gathered supplies, a small portion of food and a skin of water, a meager provision for an uncertain journey. Then, he did the unthinkable. He placed them on Hagar's shoulders, looked at his son one last time, and sent them away. Can you imagine that moment? The tears welling up in his eyes as he watched them walk into the wilderness, knowing he might never see them again? This wasn't just the separation of a father and son. This was the breaking of a family. Hagar and Ishmael had no land, no protection, no direction, only the desert stretching endlessly before them. The heat was relentless. The supplies dwindled quickly, and as the sun blazed overhead, the reality of their exile set in. What would happen now? Where would they go? And most importantly, had God truly abandoned them? Little did Ishmael know, his greatest trial was just beginning. The sun was merciless. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, offering no shade, no refuge, only an unrelenting expanse of sand and heat. Hagar's feet burned against the scorching ground. Her arms ached from carrying the last of their provision. Beside her, Ishmael, no longer a small child, but a growing young man, tried to stay strong. But the truth was undeniable. They were lost, and they were running out of water. The supplies Abraham had given them were meager, just a skin of water and some bread. Perhaps he had hoped they would find shelter quickly. Perhaps he couldn't bear to send them with nothing. But it wasn't enough. Hour after hour, the sun drained them of what little strength they had left. The dry wind offered no relief. Every step felt heavier than the last. Ishmael's breathing grew shallow. His lips cracked from thirst. His pace slowed, and then he collapsed. Hagar's heart pounded as she rushed to his side. She shook him, called his name, but he was too weak to respond. She had no more water to give him, nothing left to offer. And so, in one of the most heartbreaking moments of her life, Hagar did the only thing she could. She placed Ishmael under a bush, hoping that the sparse shade would protect him, even if only for a moment. Then she stepped away. The Bible tells us she walked about a bowshot's distance from him. Why? Because she couldn't bear to watch him die. Can you imagine that moment? The helplessness, the utter despair? She had done everything she could, and now all she could do was cry. So she wept. But Ishmael, weakened, dehydrated, barely conscious, also cried out, and God heard. Then, just as he had done years before, he sent an angel. Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying where he lies. It was a reminder of Ishmael's name. God has heard. And then came the promise. Lift the boy up and take him by the hand, for I will make him into a great nation. In that moment, something incredible happened. Hagar looked up, and there before her was a well of water. Had it always been there? Was it a miraculous appearance? The Bible doesn't say. But in that moment, it didn't matter. She ran to the well, filled her skin with fresh, cool water, and rushed back to Ishmael. She lifted his head, poured the water over his cracked lips, and watched as life returned to his body. He opened his eyes. He was going to live. And from that moment forward, Ishmael's journey would never be the same. The wilderness was no longer his enemy, became his home. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Hagar and Ishmael learned to navigate the desert. They found shelter, hunted for food, adapted to the harsh environment. Ishmael grew strong. His body hardened under the scorching sun, his mind sharpened by survival. And just as God had promised, he did not die forgotten in the wilderness. Instead, he thrived. The Bible tells us that Ishmael became an archer, a warrior of the desert. He settled in the wilderness of Paran, a vast and rugged land, untamed, and there his story continued. Hagar, determined to see her son's future secured, arranged a marriage for him, and Ishmael, the cast-out son, the one who was once on the brink of death, began his own family. But this was only the beginning, because Ishmael's descendants would grow and grow and grow. 12 sons would come from him, each one a ruler, each one the start of a great tribe, a promise fulfilled, a nation born from exile, and the legacy of Ishmael was just beginning. Ishmael had survived. Once a boy abandoned in the wilderness, he had grown into a man, hardened by the desert, shaped by struggle, and strengthened by survival. But his story didn't end there. The years passed, and Ishmael didn't just survive, he thrived. He became an archer, a warrior of the wilderness, a man whose destiny was far greater than anyone had expected. And then, just as God had promised, he began to build his own legacy. The Bible tells us that Ishmael had 12 sons. 12. It's no coincidence. The number 12 holds great significance throughout Scripture. 12 tribes of Israel, 12 apostles, 12 gates in the New Jerusalem. And just as Isaac's descendants would form the 12 tribes of Israel, Ishmael's sons would go on to become rulers of 12 great tribes of their own. Their names are recorded in Genesis: Nebaioth, Kedar, Adbeel, Mibsam, Mishma, Duma, Massa, Temad, Jetur, Naphish, Kedema. Each of them became a tribal leader, a prince, ruling over vast lands. Together, they formed a powerful confederation of nomadic tribes stretching across the Arabian Peninsula. From these 12 sons came powerful lineages that would extend through history, influencing the ancient world in ways few truly understand. Their impact was not just political but cultural. The descendants of Ishmael became skilled traders, warriors, and leaders, shaping commerce and civilization between the East and the West. And so, the prophecy was fulfilled. Ishmael, the boy who was cast out, became the father of a nation. Ishmael's descendants were known for their strength, their independence, and their mastery of the desert. The Bible describes Ishmael as a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone and everyone's hand against him. To modern ears, this may sound like a curse, but in reality, it was a mark of resilience. The donkey was a symbol of untamed strength, a creature that could survive in the harshest conditions, finding its way where others would perish. It wasn't domesticated, it wasn't controlled. It roamed freely, fearless and unyielding, and so were Ishmael's people. They became known as fierce warriors, unconquerable, independent, and deeply rooted in the desert lands they called home. For generations, Ishmael's lineage lived by their own rules, outside the control of great empires, untouched by the influence of foreign kings. Even today, many Arab nations trace their lineage back to Ishmael, believing him to be their forefather. His legacy was not forgotten. Ishmael's descendants spread across the Middle East, and his legacy took on a new dimension in religious tradition. Jewish and Christian traditions often focus on Isaac's lineage, but Ishmael's influence is undeniable. In Islamic tradition, Ishmael is considered an ancestor of the Prophet Muhammad, a central figure in the founding of the Arab people. His connection to Mecca and the Kaaba, believed to have been rebuilt by Abraham and Ishmael, marks him as a key figure in the faith. Could this be part of God's plan all along? Some theologians argue that Ishmael's role was not one of rejection, but of redirection. That while the covenant promise passed through Isaac, Ishmael's purpose was equally significant. His people would grow, his influence would expand, his name would never be forgotten. But here's something many people don't know. After years apart, after growing into two separate people, Ishmael and Isaac would meet again. Not in battle, not in conflict, but in grief. When Abraham died, both of his sons, Isaac, the son of promise, and Ishmael, the son of exile, stood side by side to bury their father. For a brief moment, the division was erased. For a brief moment, the two brothers were one again. It's a moment often overlooked, yet it carries a deep and powerful message. Even after all the years of separation, even after all the differences in their destinies, they were still bound by blood. And maybe, just maybe, this was a sign of something greater. Ishmael's story doesn't end with his survival. His legacy stretches far beyond the pages of the Bible, into history, theology, and even prophecy. For centuries, scholars, theologians, and historians have debated Ishmael's role. Was he simply a rejected son? Or was he always meant to be part of a greater divine plan? In Christian theology, the Apostle Paul makes a striking comparison between Ishmael and Isaac in Galatians 4:22-31. Paul describes Ishmael as being born according to the flesh, while Isaac was born through God's promise. This distinction is important. It suggests that Ishmael represents human effort, Abraham and Sarah's attempt to fulfill God's plan in their own way. Meanwhile, Isaac represents divine intervention, God fulfilling his promise in his time and his way. But does this mean Ishmael was cast aside? Some argue that Ishmael's exclusion from the covenant was not a rejection, but rather a redirection. His purpose was different. His descendants, though separate from Israel, would still be blessed and play a role in history. This idea challenges the misconception that Ishmael was cursed, because according to Scripture, he was still blessed. God did not abandon Ishmael. God did not forget Ishmael. Instead, he gave him a different kind of inheritance, one that would shape the world in ways Abraham could have never imagined. For centuries, Many Arab nations have traced their lineage back to Ishmael, believing him to be their forefather. Islamic tradition holds that Ishmael was not only blessed by God, but that he and his father, Abraham, played a pivotal role in history. According to Islamic teachings, Abraham and Ishmael rebuilt the Kaaba in Mecca, an event that solidified Ishmael's spiritual significance in the faith. In this tradition, Ishmael was never a lesser son. He was the patriarch of a powerful and divinely guided nation. This perspective reshapes how we view Ishmael's story. In the Islamic view, he was not rejected, he was chosen, and his people would become great, just as God had promised. Some theologians believe that Ishmael's story isn't just about the past. It may hold significance for the future. Could Ishmael's descendants still have a role to play in biblical prophecy? In Genesis, God's promise to Ishmael was clear. I will make him into a great nation. Genesis 17:20. But the prophecy also said something else. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he will live in hostility toward all his brothers. Genesis 16:12. Some interpret this as a sign of the ongoing tensions between the descendants of Isaac and Ishmael, tensions that have shaped world history for thousands of years. Could these ancient family divisions still be playing out today? The Middle East, a land deeply tied to both Isaac's and Ishmael's descendants, remains at the center of global conflicts. Some theologians believe that these historical rivalries have shaped modern geopolitics and could even play a role in the end time. Revelation, Ezekiel, other prophetic texts, they describe nations rising and falling, wars breaking out, and a great spiritual battle unfolding. Could Ishmael's descendants be part of this divine plan? Others suggest something different, that Ishmael's lineage could have a redemptive role in the future, that the division between Isaac's and Ishmael's descendants might not be permanent. In fact, some believe that biblical prophecies about a future reconciliation of nations could also involve the descendants of Ishmael. Could there be a future where the children of Abraham, both Isaac and Ishmael, find peace? Only time will tell. One of the biggest misconceptions about Ishmael is that he was cursed or completely rejected by God, but the Bible tells a different story. Yes, Isaac was chosen for the covenant, but Ishmael was never abandoned. Think about it. If Ishmael was truly cast aside, why did God send an angel to rescue Hagar and Ishmael twice, personally name Ishmael before he was even born, promise to make him into a great nation, bless him with 12 sons, just like Jacob? If God had rejected him, why would he continue to bless him? The truth is, Ishmael was part of God's larger plan, a plan that extended beyond just Israel. And while his story often seems overshadowed, his influence has shaped nations, faiths, and history in ways that cannot be. But here's something many people don't know. After years apart, after growing into two separate people, Ishmael and Isaac would meet again. Not in battle, not in conflict, but in grief. When Abraham died, both of his sons, Isaac, the son of promise, and Ishmael, the son of exile, stood side by side to bury their father. For a brief moment, the division was erased. For a brief moment, the two brothers were one again. Could this be a foreshadowing of something greater? Could this be a sign that one day, the division between Isaac's and Ishmael's descendants be reconciled? Ishmael's story is one of rejection, survival, and divine fulfillment. He may not have been the son of the covenant, but he was never forgotten by God. And his legacy, it still echoes today. Ishmael's descendants have shaped history. His name is still remembered, and his story still raises questions about faith, destiny, and God's plan for the nation. But Ishmael's story isn't just about history. It carries a powerful message, one that still speaks to us today. How often do we feel forgotten? How often do we feel cast aside, like we're not part of the promise? Ishmael's life is a reminder that God does not forget the outcast. He sees those who are struggling. He hears those who cry out. He provides for those in need. Even when the world turns away, even when life feels unfair, even when we feel rejected, God sees, God hears, and God still has a plan. So now, we turn the question to you. Do you think Ishmael was truly forgotten, or was he always part of God's greater plan? Could his descendants still have a role to play in history, or even in prophecy? What do you think Ishmael's story teaches us today? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this video insightful, don't forget to like this video to help share Ishmael's story. Subscribe for more deep dives into biblical history and prophecy. Share this with someone who might find it interesting. And as always, keep seeking, keep questioning, and keep discovering the untold stories. Until next time.